In November 2025, a 34-year-old Democratic socialist named Zohran Mamdani was elected mayor of New York City, the financial capital of the world, having run explicitly on the label that American politicians spent most of the 20th century avoiding. He opened his victory speech by quoting Eugene V. Debs, a socialist who ran for president 5 times in the early 1900s and never won more than 6% of the vote. A century after Debs's campaign sputtered out, his rhetorical heir was standing on a stage in Brooklyn as the mayor-elect of 8 million people. That single moment captures something larger happening across the United States, a word that was, for most of living memory, a Cold War slur. The kind of accusation that ended careers has become a badge some politicians now wear on purpose, and a label a growing share of the public no longer recoils from. This is not a fringe phenomenon confined to a few loud voices in New York or Vermont. Membership in the Democratic Socialists of America, the country's largest socialist organization, roughly doubled between late 2024 and the end of 2025, climbing from about 50,000 to more than 90,000 dues-paying members. And by the middle of 2026, the group said it had crossed 100,000, making it, by its own count, the largest socialist organization in American history, surpassing the old Socialist Party of America's 1912 peak. Gallup's long-running tracking poll found that in 2025, for the first time since it began asking the question in 2010, less than half of Democrats viewed capitalism favorably, while 2/3 viewed socialism favorably, a 24-point gap that has been widening since 2016. Among Americans under 30, other surveys found nearly as many people rating socialism positively as capitalism, a reversal that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, when socialist was a word wielded almost exclusively as an insult. This essay is an attempt to explain that shift without taking a side in it. It has 4 jobs. First, it traces where socialism as an idea actually came from, who its major theorists were, and how it splintered into the very different traditions that get lumped together under one word today. Second, it examines why socialism, or at least the language and imagery associated with it, has become newly attractive to a meaningful slice of the American public, breaking that appeal down into 5 distinct drivers, rather than treating it as one undifferentiated mood. Third, it looks at the political incentives at work, how politicians, on the left and the right, have learned to use the word socialism, whether by embracing it or by hurling it as an accusation, as a tool for building coalitions, raising money, and winning elections, which is a different question from whether the underlying ideas are sound. Fourth, it turns those 5 reasons over and examines the strongest counter-arguments against them, drawn from economics, history, and political theory, so that the reader is left with both sides of the ledger rather than a one-sided brief. It closes with a short reading list, drawn from socialist writers themselves and from their most serious critics, for anyone who wants to go past a magazine-length treatment and read the primary sources. A note on method before beginning. This essay tries to treat socialism as a serious and contested subject rather than as a slogan. That means resisting 2 temptations at once. One is the temptation, common among socialism's harshest critics, to treat every use of the word as a euphemism for Soviet-style central planning, when in practice, almost none of the American politicians labeled socialist today are proposing anything resembling that. The other is the temptation, common among some of socialism's defenders, to treat the word as meaning nothing more than a country with good public transit and universal health care, when the actual intellectual tradition has always had a much more specific claim at its core, about who owns and controls the means of production, that most Nordic-style welfare states do not actually implement. Getting the history right is the only way to have an honest conversation about the present. Socialism did not begin with Karl Marx, though he is the name most people reach for first. It emerged out of the shock waves of the Industrial Revolution in the first decades of the 19th century, as a response to a very specific and very visible problem. Factories were generating wealth on a scale never seen before in human history, and the people operating the machines that produced that wealth were often living in filth, working children to exhaustion, and dying young. A number of European thinkers, appalled by this contrast, began to ask whether private ownership of factories, land, and capital was itself the source of the problem, and whether a different way of organizing economic life might be possible. The earliest of these thinkers are usually grouped together as the utopian socialists, a label Marx himself later applied to them, not entirely as a compliment. Henri de Saint-Simon, a French aristocrat who had fought in the American Revolutionary War before turning to social theory, argued that society should be reorganized under the guidance of scientists, engineers, and industrialists working for the common good rather than for private profit. A vision less about class struggle than about rational planning by an enlightened technical elite. Charles Fourier, another Frenchman, proposed a far stranger scheme. Humanity should be reorganized into self-contained communities called phalanxes, where work would be matched to natural human passions, and drudgery would essentially disappear. Robert Owen, a Welsh textile manufacturer who had actually gotten rich running factories, tried to put these ideas into practice directly. He built a model industrial community at New Lanark, Scotland, with shorter working hours, education for workers' children, and decent housing, and later attempted a more ambitious experiment at New Harmony, Indiana, in the United States, which collapsed within a few years amid internal disputes over property and governance. These early socialists shared a conviction that a more cooperative, planned economic order was achievable through demonstration and persuasion rather than through revolution, which is precisely why Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels later dismissed them as naive. Marx and Engels represent the decisive turn in socialist thought, the point at which it became less a set of utopian blueprints and more a theory of historical change with its own internal logic. Marx, a German philosopher and economist who spent much of his adult life in exile in London, and Engels, the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer who used his own income to support Marx's decades of research, together produced the texts that would define socialist and communist movements for the next century and a half. Their 1848 pamphlet, commonly translated as the Communist Manifesto, argued that all of recorded history could be understood as a series of struggles between economic classes, and that the industrial era had simplified that struggle into a contest between the bourgeoisie, who owned factories and capital, and the proletariat, the industrial working class who owned nothing but their own labor. Marx's later and far more technical work, most importantly the multi-volume Capital, tried to demonstrate mathematically why capitalism was prone to repeated crises, and why, in his view, it would eventually be replaced by a system in which the workers themselves own the means of production collectively, first through a transitional stage he called socialism, and eventually through a stateless, classless final stage he called communism. It is worth being precise here because the terms get flattened in everyday use. In the classical Marxist framework, socialism and communism are not synonyms but sequential stages, with socialism referring to collective ownership under a workers' state, and communism referring to a later, stateless condition that, in the historical record, no country has ever claimed to reach. Marx's ideas did not stay confined to the printed page. In the following decades, they were picked up, argued over, and split apart by rival interpreters, and the fractures that emerged among them are the reasons socialism today can refer to things as different as the government of Denmark and the government that ruled the Soviet Union. Eduard Bernstein, a German socialist writing at the turn of the 20th century, argued that Marx's predictions of capitalism's collapse were not coming true. Living standards for workers in industrializing Europe were rising, not falling, and democratic institutions were expanding rather than being crushed by an ever more repressive bourgeoisie. Bernstein concluded that socialists should abandon the goal of revolution and instead work through elections, labor unions, and legislation to gradually humanize capitalism. Shorter workdays, the right to organize, public pensions, and eventually a broad welfare state. This position, often called revisionism by its critics, is the direct ancestor of modern European social democracy, the tradition behind parties like Germany's Social Democratic Party, and behind the Nordic welfare states that are frequently, and as this essay will discuss later, somewhat inaccurately, cited as living examples of socialism in American political debate. On the other side of that split stood Vladimir Lenin, who led the Bolshevik faction of Russia's Marxist movement and seized power in the October Revolution of 1917. Lenin rejected Bernstein's gradualism outright. In his view, capitalism would not be reformed away by patient legislating. It had to be overthrown by a disciplined vanguard party acting on behalf of the working class, which would then hold power through a transitional dictatorship of the proletariat until a classless society could be built. The state that Lenin and his successors constructed, nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, a single ruling party, and a command economy directed by central planners rather than by market prices, became the model for Marxist-Leninist regimes throughout the 20th century, from Stalin's Soviet Union to Mao's China to Castro's Cuba, each adapting the framework to its own circumstances and often diverging sharply from one another and from Marx's original writing. It was this Leninist and Stalinist branch of the socialist family tree, and its documented record of famine, political terror, and authoritarian rule, that shaped most Americans' visceral association with the word socialism throughout the Cold War, an association this essay will return to when it examines the counter-arguments later on. Beyond the reform versus revolution split, several other distinct strands are worth naming, because they get folded indiscriminately into socialism in American political conversation, despite being genuinely different projects. Anarchism and libertarian socialism, associated with thinkers like Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, agreed with Marx that capitalism should be abolished, but rejected the idea of using a centralized state to do it, arguing that concentrated state power was itself a source of oppression, regardless of which class controlled it. They favored decentralized, voluntary federations of worker and community councils instead. Market socialism, a later and less famous tradition associated with economists like Oscar Lange, tried to combine collective or public ownership of enterprises with the price signals and competitive mechanisms of a market, an attempt to capture some of capitalism's efficiency without its private ownership structure. Yugoslavia's system of worker self-management under Josip Broz Tito was a real-world, if imperfect, experiment along these lines. Democratic socialism, the label most commonly claimed by the current generation of American politicians, generally means a commitment to expanding democratic control through elections, unions, and public ownership of certain key industries over economic decisions that are currently made by private capital, while preserving multi-party democracy and civil liberties, distinguishing it explicitly from the one-party Leninist model. And social democracy, distinct again, generally accepts a predominantly capitalist, privately owned market economy, but pairs it with heavy taxation, strong labor protections, and an extensive welfare state to redistribute the proceeds, which is why economists frequently point out that countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are better described as highly regulated capitalist economies with generous welfare states than as socialist economies in the classical sense, since the overwhelming majority of enterprises in those countries remain privately owned and are allocated through markets, not by state planners. A handful of other architects deserve mention because their arguments still surface, often unattributed, in today's debates. Rosa Luxemburg, a Polish-German revolutionary active in the early 20th century, broke with Lenin from the left rather than the right, arguing that a revolution imposed by a small, disciplined vanguard party without genuine mass democratic participation would inevitably curdle into bureaucratic dictatorship, regardless of its founders' intentions. A warning many later critics of the Soviet Union, including some sympathetic to socialism, consider prophetic given what followed under Stalin. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist writing from a fascist prison in the 1920s and 1930s, argued that capitalism survived not merely through economic coercion, but through what he called cultural hegemony, the way a ruling class's values, assumptions, and common sense come to be accepted as natural and inevitable by the very people those values disadvantage, an idea that has proven enormously influential, well beyond economics, shaping later academic and activist thinking about media, education, and culture as sites of political struggle. Norman Thomas, who ran for president 6 times on the Socialist Party ticket between 1928 and 1948, after inheriting Debs's role as the movement's public face, pushed the party toward advocating specific reforms: unemployment insurance, Social Security, the 40-hour work week, many of which were eventually adopted by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, not by a socialist government, but by a reformed capitalist one, a fact socialists and their critics still cite for opposite reasons. Socialists argue it proves their ideas work once implemented, while critics argue it proves capitalism can absorb and diffuse socialist pressure through reform, rather than requiring revolution at all. It is also worth being precise about the difference between socialism and communism, as those words are used technically, since American political conversation frequently treats them as interchangeable, when the tradition itself does not. In classical Marxist theory, communism was never meant to describe the 20th century's actually existing one-party states. It referred to a hypothetical final stage of history, reached only after a long socialist transition, in which the state itself would have withered away. Material scarcity would have been overcome, and goods would be distributed according to need, rather than allocated by markets or by government rationing. No self-described communist government in history, not the Soviet Union, not Maoist China, not Cuba, ever claimed to have reached this stage. Each described itself as still building socialism, with true communism reserved for an indefinite future. This distinction is not merely academic pedantry. It explains why many contemporary democratic socialists object strenuously to being called communists. In their own framework, communism describes a stateless utopia that has never existed anywhere, while democratic socialism describes a concrete, much more limited program of expanding public ownership and worker power within an ongoing multi-party democracy, closer in spirit to Bernstein's reformism than to Lenin's revolutionary vanguard. Socialism arrived in the United States early and never fully disappeared, even though it never became a majority movement. Eugene V. Debs, a labor organizer who had led a national railway strike in 1894, ran for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920 on the Socialist Party of America ticket, once campaigning from a prison cell after being convicted of sedition for opposing American entry into the First World War. He won nearly 1 million votes, roughly 6% of the total, in 1912, the high watermark for socialist electoral politics in America until the current era. The Socialist Party's membership peaked around 113,000 in 1912, before splintering over the Bolshevik Revolution, fading through the Red Scares of the 1920s and the McCarthyism of the 1950s, and never fully recovering. Its most durable modern descendant, the Democratic Socialists of America, was founded in 1982 through a merger led by the writer and activist Michael Harrington, whose 1962 book, The Other America, had documented persistent poverty amid post-war prosperity and helped inspire the Kennedy and Johnson administration's war on poverty. For most of its existence, DSA was a small organization of a few thousand members, a minor presence on the far edges of American left politics. That changed decisively in 2016. The intervening decades are worth a brief pause, because they explain why the word carried so much stigma for so long that its recent rehabilitation counts as genuinely surprising. American socialism's slow decline after Debs's era was not simply a matter of the public losing interest. It was actively suppressed at several points. During the first Red Scare, following the Bolshevik Revolution, and a wave of anarchist bombings in 1919 and 1920, the federal government carried out the Palmer Raids, arresting thousands of suspected radicals, many with only loose or no connection to violent activity, and deporting hundreds without full due process. The Socialist Party never recovered its pre-war membership after this crackdown, and it splintered further when a faction sympathetic to the Bolsheviks broke away to found what became the Communist Party USA, dividing the American left between a reformist, electorally oriented socialist wing and a smaller, more revolutionary communist wing, aligned, at various points, quite closely with Moscow. That communist wing's international ties became a serious liability once the Cold War began. The Second Red Scare, associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy in the early 1950s, again targeted anyone with real or suspected ties to Communist Party organizing, costing thousands of people their jobs, reputations, and in some cases their freedom, and cementing socialist and communist as functionally interchangeable slurs in mainstream American political culture for the rest of the 20th century, regardless of which specific tradition, reformist or revolutionary, democratic or Leninist, an individual actually belonged to. It is against this backdrop of decades of active suppression and social stigma that DSA operated as a marginal organization for most of its history, and it is against this same backdrop that the scale of its recent growth becomes genuinely remarkable. An organization descended from a movement the federal government spent much of the 20th century actively working to dismantle has, within roughly a decade, become large enough to help elect the mayor of the country's largest city. Bernie Sanders, an independent senator from Vermont who had identified as a Democratic Socialist for decades, entered the 2016 Democratic presidential primary as a long-shot protest candidate against Hillary Clinton, and ended up winning over 13 million votes in 23 states, running on Medicare for all, free public college tuition, and a wealth tax on the richest Americans. He lost the nomination, but his campaign did something no American socialist candidate had managed in a century. It made the label mainstream enough that a new generation of young left-wing activists stopped treating it as radioactive. DSA's own membership data tells the story of what followed. The organization had hovered around 5,000 members for decades before Sanders' first campaign. Between 2016 and 2020, membership exploded to roughly 50,000, driven first by Donald Trump's election in November 2016, and then by Sanders' second presidential run in 2020. Growth stalled and even reversed somewhat during the Biden administration, dropping to around 50,000 members by October 2024. Then it surged again, first after Trump's 2024 re-election, and then, even more dramatically, after a young state assemblyman named Zohran Mamdani launched an underdog campaign for New York City mayor in the fall of 2024. Mamdani's rise illustrates how thoroughly the socialist label has been rehabilitated in certain corners of American politics. He entered the mayoral race, polling at roughly 1%, defeated the far better funded and better known former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary in June 2025, and then beat him again in the general election that November, winning just over 50% of the vote against Cuomo's independent run and a Republican challenger. He ran openly as a Democratic Socialist, campaigning on rent freezes for stabilized apartments, free public buses, city-run grocery stores, and universal child care. And he became, at 34, the youngest New York City mayor in over a century, as well as its first Muslim and first South Asian mayor. His win triggered a documented surge in DSA membership nationally. The organization's own figures show membership roughly doubling in the 18 months after he launched his campaign. And it emboldened a wider slate of DSA-aligned candidates who went on to win primaries and local offices across the country through 2025 and into 2026, with more than 250 DSA members or endorsees now holding office in 40 states, the large majority of them elected since 2019. The polling behind this movement is worth sitting with rather than skimming past, because it shows a real and measurable shift in public sentiment, not just a handful of splashy election results. Gallup's tracking survey, conducted every few years since 2010, found in August 2025 that Americans' favorable view of capitalism had fallen to 54%, its lowest point since Gallup started asking the question, down from 60% in 2021, while favorable views of socialism held roughly steady at 39%. The partisan breakdown is where the real story lives. For the first time on record, less than half of Democrats, just 42%, viewed capitalism favorably, while 66% viewed socialism favorably, a 24-point gap that has widened continuously since 2016. Republicans moved in the opposite direction and remain overwhelmingly favorable toward capitalism and hostile toward socialism. Independents lean modestly pro-capitalism, but have also cooled somewhat. Separate polling from YouGov and The Economist in December 2025 found that among adults 18 to 29, capitalism and socialism were rated almost identically as the better system. 26% chose capitalism, 28% chose socialism, and the rest were unsure. A result that would have been almost unimaginable in American polling a decade earlier, when socialism was reliably one of the least popular words a politician could attach to themselves. It is worth pausing on what people actually mean when they tell pollsters they have a positive view of socialism, because Gallup's own research suggests the term means something looser and less doctrinaire to most respondents today than it did to earlier generations, and certainly looser than the classical definition involving state or collective ownership of the means of production. When Gallup asked Americans in 1949 to define socialism in their own words, the most common answer was government ownership of industry, close to the textbook definition. Gallup's more recent research finds Americans, and Democrats especially, are now more likely to associate the word with equality and with government provision of benefits and services like healthcare and education, rather than with public ownership of factories or farms. In other words, part of what has changed is not just how many Americans like the word socialism, but what the word has come to mean in the popular imagination, a shift that matters enormously for understanding both the appeal of the new wave and the strength of the arguments against it, since a critique aimed at Soviet-style central planning does not necessarily land against a politician whose actual platform is closer to Scandinavian-style social democracy. Understanding why a meaningful share of Americans, particularly younger ones, have grown more receptive to socialist ideas and language requires separating out several distinct threads that get bundled together in casual conversation. They are related, but they are not the same thing, and treating them as one undifferentiated mood misses why the movement has staying power. Here are 5 of the most significant drivers, examined in turn. The first driver is the visible, measurable, and accelerating concentration of American wealth. This is not a matter of perception or vibes. It shows up plainly in Federal Reserve data. As of the third quarter of 2025, the wealthiest 1% of American households controlled 31.7% of the nation's total wealth, the highest share the Federal Reserve has recorded since it began tracking the figure in 1989, and by some comparisons, the highest concentration since the years before the Great Depression. In dollar terms, that 1% held roughly $55 trillion in assets, nearly as much as the entire bottom 90% of American households combined. Within that top slice, the concentration is even sharper. The wealthiest 1/10 of 1% alone holds more than 14% of the country's total wealth, and that group's fortunes grew 40% over a recent 3-year period, twice the pace of the bottom 90%'s wealth growth. Much of this divergence has been driven by a booming stock market, and stock ownership itself is heavily concentrated among higher earners. The vast majority of Americans who own significant stock holdings live in households earning over $100,000 a year, while middle and working class wealth remains tied up disproportionately in housing, an asset class that has grown far more slowly. For people watching this data, or simply watching the gap between their own paycheck and the headlines about billionaire net worth, socialism's core historical claim that concentrated private ownership of capital produces concentrated private power, and that this concentration will only intensify over time absent structural intervention, starts to feel less like 19th century theory and more like a live description of the world they are living in. Economists who study long-run inequality, most notably Thomas Piketty in his widely discussed work on capital, have argued that this pattern is not incidental but structural. When the rate of return on capital consistently exceeds the overall growth rate of the economy, as it has for most of the past several decades, wealth concentrates among existing asset owners faster than the broader economy grows, meaning inherited and invested capital compounds ahead of wages, regardless of how hard any individual works for a paycheck. Comparisons to the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th century, when railroad and industrial fortunes reached a level of dominance over the American economy not seen again until recently, have become a recurring reference point in this discussion. Some economists calculating the concentration of wealth among the very richest Americans today find it has now surpassed, by some measures, the levels recorded during that earlier era of robber barons and trust monopolies, a comparison socialist commentators invoke frequently, and one that even researchers skeptical of socialist remedies have found difficult to dismiss on the data alone. The second driver is the specific and personal experience of unaffordability in housing, healthcare, and higher education, which functions differently from abstract inequality statistics because it is felt directly in a monthly budget rather than read about in a headline. Total student loan debt in the United States passed $1.87 trillion by early 2026, and the average federal borrower now carries just under $40,000 in debt, roughly double what a typical borrower owed in 2007. That debt has real downstream effects. More than half of borrowers surveyed say they have delayed a major life milestone because of it, most commonly saving for retirement, buying a home, or getting married. and borrowers carrying student debt buy homes that are, on average, nearly 40% less expensive than those bought by debt-free peers, when they are able to buy at all. Housing affordability has deteriorated alongside this. The average age of a first-time homebuyer in America reached an all-time high of 40 in 2025, a milestone that used to arrive for most people in their late 20s or early 30s. Healthcare costs compound the picture. When enhanced insurance subsidies created during the pandemic expired at the end of 2025, the average annual premium payment on the individual insurance marketplace roughly doubled. For a generation encountering these costs simultaneously, college debt, a housing market that requires a six-figure income in many cities, and healthcare premiums that can consume a meaningful share of a paycheck, proposals like Medicare for All, free public college, and large-scale public housing construction are not abstract ideological positions. They are direct, itemized responses to specific, itemized financial pain, which is a large part of why they poll well, even among people who are personally uncomfortable with the word socialist. The third driver is a broader collapse of trust in the institutions that capitalism's defenders point to as evidence of the system working. Big business, the financial sector, and notably, the federal government itself, whose approval Americans have rated far more negatively over the past 15 years than in the post-war decades. Gallup's data shows that positive views of big business specifically, as distinct from small business or entrepreneurship, have fallen from a majority in the early 2010s to just 37% favorable by 2025, with 62% holding a negative view, even as small businesses and the broad idea of free enterprise continue to be rated positively by the overwhelming majority of Americans across every age group and party. This distinction matters. The data suggests what is souring is not a rejection of markets, competition, or entrepreneurship as such, but a specific and sharpening resentment of concentrated corporate power. A sense that large, publicly traded corporations, insurers, landlords, and financial institutions have become unaccountable to the customers and workers who depend on them, extracting value rather than creating it. Socialist and social democratic politicians have built their appeal substantially around this distinction, framing themselves not as opponents of markets or work or ambition, but as opponents specifically of corporate concentration and of a political system, funded heavily by corporate donors and lobbyists, that they argue has stopped responding to ordinary voters, regardless of which party holds office. That framing lands with people who have lost confidence in mainstream institutions generally, not only economic ones. Congress itself has recorded some of the lowest approval ratings of any American institution tracked by pollsters for most of the past 15 years, frequently sitting in the high teens or low 20s in Gallup surveys, a level of disapproval shared with relatively few other institutions in American life. Confidence in newspapers, television news, and the presidency has followed a broadly similar downward trajectory over the same period, even as confidence in the military and small business has remained comparatively resilient. Socialist and social democratic politicians have positioned themselves as outsiders to the eroded institutional landscape, campaigning explicitly against what they describe as an oligarchic capture of government by wealthy donors and corporate lobbyists. Sanders has built entire tours, alongside Ocasio-Cortez, around the theme of fighting oligarchy rather than fighting the opposing political party as such, a framing that lets them appeal simultaneously to voters angry at Republicans, voters angry at establishment Democrats, and voters who simply distrust institutional power in general, a broader coalition than a narrower partisan appeal could reach on its own. The fourth driver is generational and informational, a shift in who is doing the persuading and how. Socialist ideas in the current wave are transmitted less through pamphlets and union halls, as in Debs's era, and more through short-form video, podcasts, and social media accounts run by young organizers and elected officials themselves, reaching an audience that came of age during the 2008 financial crisis, the slow and unequal recovery that followed it, a pandemic that further exposed gaps in the American social safety net, and now a cost-of-living environment that many young adults experience as structurally worse than the one their parents faced at the same age, regardless of whether the aggregate statistics fully support that perception. Politicians like Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and more recently Mamdani, have proven unusually effective at using this media environment directly, bypassing traditional political gatekeepers and cable news framing to speak to younger voters in their own information ecosystem. This is a genuinely new capability that Debs and even Harrington did not have, and it has allowed socialist and social democratic ideas to spread through networks of trust, peers, respected online voices, viral clips of a candidate speaking plainly about rent or healthcare costs, rather than requiring approval from party leadership or the editorial boards that used to gatekeep which ideas counted as electorally serious. The fifth driver is more idealistic and less transactional than the first four. A moral discomfort with extreme inequality that exists independently of any individual's personal financial situation. Not everyone drawn to socialist rhetoric is themselves struggling financially. Surveys of DSA's own membership base find it is disproportionately college-educated, and a meaningful share of members report household incomes above $100,000 a year. What connects these members to the movement is not always personal economic desperation, but a broader ethical claim, one with deep roots in the socialist tradition, going back to its utopian originators. That a system generating billionaires alongside widespread homelessness, medical bankruptcy, and food insecurity is not merely inefficient but unjust, and that a wealthy society has an obligation to guarantee its members a decent floor of material security, healthcare, housing, food, education, as a matter of right rather than as a product to be purchased according to one's ability to pay. This is fundamentally a values-based appeal rather than a strictly economic one, closer to a religious or humanist conviction about human dignity than to a technical argument about GDP growth rates. And it explains why the socialist label continues to attract idealistic, often young and educated, adherents even in periods when the American economy is, by conventional aggregate measures, performing reasonably well. This strand of the appeal draws, whether its adherents realize it or not, on a broader current in 20th century political philosophy that runs beyond Marx himself. The philosopher John Rawls, for instance, though not a socialist and working within a liberal rather than Marxist tradition, argued in his influential 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, that a just society is one whose basic economic arrangements a person would accept, even without knowing in advance whether they would be born wealthy or poor, gifted or disadvantaged. A thought experiment Rawls called the veil of ignorance, and one that tends, in his own analysis, to favor economic arrangements guaranteeing a substantial floor of security for the worst off, rather than arrangements that simply maximize aggregate wealth. Many contemporary democratic socialists, whether or not they have read Rawls directly, are making a version of this same argument when they frame healthcare, housing, or education as rights rather than as commodities. Not primarily an empirical claim about GDP growth rates or economic efficiency, but a moral claim about what a decent society owes the people born into it, regardless of their market outcomes. It would be incomplete to describe socialism's rising appeal purely as an organic response to material conditions, without also examining how deliberately both major parties have learned to use the word itself as a political instrument, because the strategic incentives at work are just as important to understanding the current moment as the underlying economic anxieties are. For a growing number of Democratic-aligned candidates, especially in safely progressive districts and cities, embracing the Democratic Socialist label has become a genuine electoral asset rather than a liability, and the mechanics of why are fairly straightforward. It signals authenticity and distance from an incumbent political establishment that polls show voters across the spectrum increasingly distrust. It energizes a base of small-dollar donors and campaign volunteers who have shown themselves willing to fuel underdog campaigns, as Mamdani's did, without relying on traditional major donors or party infrastructure. And it generates outsized media attention, since a socialist candidate winning a competitive race is, almost by definition, a more newsworthy story than a conventional Democrat winning one. The Democratic Socialists of America has built real organizational infrastructure around this dynamic. Chapters in all 50 states, coordinated field operations, and a track record of get-out-the-vote work that establishment Democratic campaigns have increasingly sought to draw on rather than compete against. Particularly after Mamdani's win and a subsequent string of 2026 primary victories by DSA-backed candidates against sitting Democratic incumbents. Mamdani was not the first to demonstrate this electoral logic. He simply demonstrated it most dramatically. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a DSA member herself, unseated a 10-term incumbent member of Democratic leadership in a 2018 primary upset that first proved a self-identified Democratic socialist, running on a shoestring budget against an entrenched incumbent with vastly more institutional support, could win in a major American city. And her subsequent career as one of the most recognizable and online-savvy members of Congress helped normalize the label for a national audience well beyond her own district. A loose group of similarly aligned progressive members of Congress, informally called the Squad by the press, expanded on that model in the elections that followed. DSA's relationship with these officials, however, has not been uniformly smooth, which is itself instructive about how contested the socialist label remains even within the movement. Internal disputes over foreign policy, most sharply over the war in Gaza, led DSA's national body to formally withdraw its endorsement of Ocasio-Cortez in 2024, even as her own New York City chapter chose to maintain its support, illustrating that democratic socialism in practice describes a coalition with real internal disagreements rather than a single unified platform issued from the top down. The financial mechanics of this strategy also matter and are rarely discussed as bluntly as the ideological ones. Socialist-aligned candidates have proven unusually effective at raising large sums through small dollar donations, often $5, $20, or $50 at a time from thousands of individual donors, which allows them to credibly claim independence from the corporate political action committees and major donors that fund most competitive American campaigns, a claim that resonates precisely because of the institutional distrust described earlier in this essay. This financing model is not merely a moral statement, it is also functionally a competitive advantage in a media environment that rewards authenticity narratives. And campaign finance data shows candidates who forego corporate PAC money and lean into small dollar fundraising often generate disproportionate free media coverage relative to campaigns funded more conventionally, effectively converting an ideological commitment into an operational one. Some of these dynamics point toward a strategic split within the Democratic coalition, with the party's more establishment wing facing real pressure to either accommodate an increasingly organized and well-funded socialist bloc within its ranks, or risk that bloc peeling off into more independent electoral vehicles over time. At the same time, and just as deliberately, the label has become a central weapon in Republican political messaging, used less as a precise description of any given Democrat's actual policy platform, and more as a broad-brush accusation intended to trigger Cold War-era associations with authoritarianism, economic collapse, and the loss of personal freedom. This is a long-standing tactic in American politics. Republicans attacked Franklin Roosevelt's Social Security program, Harry Truman's National Health Insurance proposal, and Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act, all as creeping socialism in their respective eras, even though none of them involved government ownership of productive industry in the way the term classically implies. But the tactic has intensified rather than faded, as self-identified socialists have actually begun winning elections, giving the accusation a concrete face and a concrete governing record to point to. President Trump, for instance, has publicly argued that the term democratic socialist is a deliberately softened rebranding of communism, chosen specifically because it sounds nice, and Republican campaign committees have made opposition to what they term the socialist takeover of the Democratic Party a central message heading into the 2026 midterm elections, with some House Democrats in competitive swing districts explicitly distancing themselves from the socialist label and betting that an anti-socialist brand of their own can help them hold seats that voted for Trump. What this reveals is that socialism, as a term in current American political discourse, is functioning simultaneously as two different things: a genuine, substantive ideological commitment for a growing number of organizers, candidates, and voters who have thought carefully about political economy and concluded that expanded public ownership and democratic control over key economic decisions is the right direction for the country, and a rhetorical weapon deployed opportunistically by politicians across the spectrum, Democrats using it to signal authenticity and mobilize donors, Republicans using it to signal danger and mobilize their own base, regardless of how precisely it describes the policy actually being proposed. Both of these things can be true at once, and untangling them is essential to evaluating the substance of the underlying policy debates on their own terms, rather than being swept along by the label alone in either direction. Having laid out the reasons socialism has gained genuine traction, it is worth taking each of those 5 drivers in turn and examining the strongest arguments that critics, economists, historians, and political theorists working in the classical liberal, free market, and conservative traditions have raised against them. This section does not attempt to declare a winner. It aims to present the counter-arguments with the same seriousness given to the case for socialism above, so the reader can weigh both. On wealth inequality, critics of the redistributive response to inequality data do not typically dispute the Federal Reserve's numbers themselves, but they dispute what those numbers mean and what follows from them. A common objection is that wealth concentration figures capture a snapshot of static asset ownership at one moment, rather than tracking the actual movement of individual households up and down the income ladder over time, and that American economic mobility, while imperfect, remains real. A large share of people in the bottom income quintile in any given year are not there a decade later. Economists in the Austrian and Chicago schools, most associated with Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, have long argued that inequality generated by voluntary exchange and by rewarding productive risk-taking is categorically different from inequality generated by force or fraud, and that attempting to flatten it through heavy taxation or expropriation risks destroying the very incentives that generate innovation, investment, and job creation in the first place. The entrepreneurs building the next major company, the argument goes, are disproportionately drawn from the pool of people who stand to become wealthy if they succeed. A further point critics raise is that much of the recent surge in top 1% wealth reflects stock market gains tied to a small number of already successful companies, particularly around artificial intelligence, and that broad-based taxation targeting billionaire wealth, such as unrealized capital gains, faces serious administrative and valuation challenges. One tax foundation analysis of a proposed federal wealth tax found it would raise substantial revenue, but also shrink long-run GDP and risk pushing capital and its owners offshore, reducing the very tax base the policy is meant to capture. On the affordability crisis in housing, healthcare, and education, critics generally do not deny that costs in these sectors have risen sharply, but they frequently argue the causal story runs in the opposite direction from the one socialist and progressive politicians tell, that government intervention itself, not its absence, is a primary driver of the price increases. In housing, critics point to restrictive local zoning laws, permitting delays, and rent control policies, many enacted by the same progressive city governments now campaigning against unaffordability as the dominant suppressors of housing supply, arguing that expanding the housing stock through deregulation would do more to lower prices than public ownership or rent freezes, which economists across a fairly wide ideological range agree tend to reduce the quality and quantity of available rental housing over time, even when they help existing tenants in the short run. In higher education, critics point to the fact that the expansion of federal student lending itself has been correlated with, and by some economic analyses, has directly enabled tuition increases, since universities can raise prices knowing that federal loan programs will absorb much of the cost, a dynamic sometimes called the Bennett hypothesis, after a 1987 argument by then Education Secretary William Bennett. A 2026 example cited by some commentators involved a university trimming a graduate program's tuition to land exactly at a new federal loan cap, illustrating how closely institutional pricing can track available subsidy rather than actual cost. In healthcare, critics of single-payer proposals argue that countries with government-run systems often ration care through waiting lists rather than eliminating scarcity, that the American system's high costs stem substantially from provider consolidation, defensive medicine driven by malpractice litigation, and a tax-favored employer insurance system that insulates most consumers from the price of care they consume. and that a full government takeover of insurance and provider payment risks the same kind of price and quality distortions seen when the same government's own program subsidies were withdrawn, as happened with marketplace premiums at the end of 2025, on distrust in big business and concentrated corporate power. Critics generally agree the underlying sentiment reflects real problems, but argue the solution favored by socialists, nationalization or heavy state control of major industries, tends to replace one form of concentrated, unaccountable power with another, arguably worse one, since a state-run monopoly typically faces even less competitive pressure and consumer choice than a private company operating in a market with, however imperfect, ongoing antitrust enforcement, the threat of new entrants, and the discipline of shareholders and consumers who can simply take their business elsewhere. The economist Ludwig von Mises, writing in the 1920s, made an argument that later economists have called the economic calculation problem. Without market prices generated by competing private owners of capital freely buying and selling, a central planning authority, however well-intentioned, has no reliable way to know which goods are genuinely scarce, which investments create more value than they consume, or how to allocate resources efficiently across an economy of any real complexity. A critique many economists argue was borne out by the chronic shortages, misallocated production, and eventual stagnation experienced across most centrally planned 20th century economies. Critics also point out that many of the industries voters are most frustrated with today, health insurance, telecommunications, banking, are already among the most heavily regulated sectors of the American economy, arguing that the problem in many cases is regulatory capture and barriers that protect incumbents from new competition, rather than insufficient government control as such, and that more state power over these industries could deepen rather than solve the underlying accountability problem. On the generational and informational shift driving socialism's spread through social media and youth networks, critics argue that virality and youthful enthusiasm are not, by themselves, evidence that an idea is correct, and note that the political and economic history most persuasive to socialism's current audience, the failures of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and more recent examples like Venezuela, occurred before most of that audience was born, and is often taught, if at all, without the lived memory or emotional weight that made it viscerally persuasive to earlier generations who lived through the Cold War directly. Venezuela is frequently cited in this argument as the most recent and most thoroughly documented case study. Under Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolas Maduro, the government nationalized large parts of the agricultural sector, oil industry, utilities, banking, and retail, imposed strict currency and price controls, and expanded welfare spending, funded increasingly by printing money once oil revenue could no longer cover it. The result, by multiple independent economic analyses, was a roughly 80% contraction in GDP over less than a decade, inflation that reached over 100,000% in 2018 alone, and an exodus of more than 7 million people, one of the largest peacetime migrations in modern history, from a country that in 1950 had one of the highest per capita incomes in South America. Defenders of the Venezuelan government and some sympathetic commentators point to American sanctions, corruption, and Maduro's authoritarian consolidation of power as major contributing or even primary causes of the collapse, rather than socialism as an economic model per se. And serious analysts disagree about how to weight these factors relative to one another. But even accounts sympathetic to that view generally acknowledge that the core collapse in production, hyperinflation driven by currency printing, and mass emigration were well underway years before the most significant American oil sanctions took effect in 2019, which critics take as strong evidence that the nationalization, price control, and money printing policies themselves, not external pressure, were the primary drivers of the disaster. On the moral and idealistic appeal of guaranteeing material security as a right, critics do not typically dispute the underlying compassion behind this argument, but contend that the socialist tradition's proposed mechanism, collective or state ownership and control of the means of production, is neither the only nor the most effective way to achieve it, and point to an alternative empirical pattern. The countries most frequently cited as socialist success stories by American progressives, particularly the Nordic states of Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, are not, in fact, socialist by the classical definition at all. Their economies remain overwhelmingly privately owned and market-based. The World Bank and OECD both rank several of them among the most business-friendly economies in the world, with fewer regulatory burdens on starting a company than the United States in some measures. And what distinguishes them is not public ownership of factories or firms, but very high, broad-based taxation, often falling heavily on middle-income earners through value-added taxes, not just the wealthy, funding a generous welfare state layered on top of that market economy. Danish and Swedish political leaders, including several prime ministers, have explicitly and repeatedly rejected the socialist label for their own systems, describing them instead as market economies with strong social safety nets, a distinction critics argue American socialists frequently blur when citing these countries as proof of concept, since the actual American democratic socialist policy platform, which typically calls for public ownership of housing, utilities, and parts of the healthcare and banking sectors, goes considerably further than anything currently practiced in Copenhagen, Stockholm, or Oslo. Critics also push back on the philosophical framing of material goods as unconditional rights, divorced from any question of cost or trade-off. Robert Nozick, writing partly in direct response to Rawls, argued in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that redistributive schemes guaranteeing outcomes to some necessarily require taking justly acquired holdings from others without their consent, which he considered a violation of individual liberty, regardless of how compassionate the stated goal. On this view, a right to health care or housing is meaningfully different from a right to speech or a fair trial, because honoring it requires compelling someone else's labor or property, rather than simply refraining from interference. Other critics take a more pragmatic than philosophical line, arguing that calling something a right does not by itself create the doctors, hospital beds, construction workers, or housing units needed to deliver it, and that societies still face the underlying scarcity and trade-off problems classical economics describes, regardless of the moral language used to frame the policy goal. A point they argue is illustrated precisely by countries that have tried to guarantee housing or health care through heavy state control and price setting alone, without also expanding the underlying productive capacity to deliver on the promise, and have ended up with the shortages, waiting lists, or fiscal crises described elsewhere in this section. On the broader historical record of centrally planned economies beyond Venezuela, critics argue that Venezuela is not an isolated outlier, but one recent data point in a much longer pattern. The Soviet Union's forced collectivization of agriculture under Stalin in the early 1930s, intended to eliminate private land ownership and consolidate farming into state and collective enterprises, produced a catastrophic famine that killed an estimated 5 to 7 million people, concentrated especially in Ukraine, where it is remembered as the Holodomor. Historians continue to debate how much of this was the result of policy failure versus deliberate political repression of Ukrainian farmers, but few dispute that central planning and forced collectivization were the proximate causes. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward in China, an attempt in the late 1950s to rapidly collectivize agriculture and industrialize the countryside through centrally mandated production quotas, is estimated by most historians to have caused a famine that killed between 15 and 45 million people, commonly cited as the deadliest famine in recorded human history. Cuba, Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and North Korea offer further examples across a range of severity, each combining central economic planning with single-party political control, and each accompanied by documented episodes of severe economic shortage, political repression, or both. Defenders of socialism generally respond to this list in one of two ways, either by arguing that these regimes represent a corruption or betrayal of authentic Marxist principles, rather than a natural consequence of them, pointing to democratic socialists like Bernstein and to the Nordic model as the tradition's true and more successful expression, or by arguing that Cold War-era hostility, sanctions, and military encirclement from Western capitalist powers made peaceful, well-functioning socialist development impossible to fairly test in the first place. Critics counter that this "not real socialism" defense has been offered after nearly every one of the tradition's major 20th century implementations, and that a theory whose real-world applications reliably diverge from its stated ideals, across dramatically different countries, cultures, and historical circumstances, over the better part of a century, deserves to be judged in part by that consistent pattern of divergence, rather than solely by its most idealized theoretical form. An argument socialists, in turn, contest by pointing out that capitalism is rarely judged by the same standard, since its defenders do not typically treat the Gilded Age, colonial extraction, or the 2008 financial crisis as disqualifying failures of capitalism itself. Taken together, these counter-arguments do not amount to a claim that the conditions driving socialism's appeal are imaginary. The wealth data, the debt data, and the affordability data are real and independently verifiable, but they represent a serious, evidence-based case that the specific remedies most associated with socialism, historically and in its current American revival, carry their own well-documented risks and have, in their fullest historical implementations, produced worse outcomes for the very people they were designed to help, and that some of the reforms most popular, even among socialism's American sympathizers, such as the Nordic welfare state, are better understood as achievements of regulated capitalism than of socialism proper. The new wave of socialism in American politics is neither a manufactured illusion nor a simple, inevitable response to economic conditions. It is a genuine convergence of several distinct forces: measurable wealth concentration, the lived experience of unaffordable housing, healthcare, and education, eroding trust in large institutions, a new generation reached through new media, and an enduring moral discomfort with extreme inequality, meeting a political environment in which both major parties have found strategic reasons to amplify the word socialism, whether by claiming it or by wielding it as a warning. The historical tradition behind the word is far richer and more internally divided than either its boosters or its critics typically acknowledge in a soundbite. The same label covers everything from Scandinavian-style social democracy operating within a market economy to the centrally planned, single-party systems of the 20th century's Marxist-Leninist states, and collapsing that range into a single monolithic idea in either direction obscures more than it reveals. What can be said with confidence is that the conditions fueling the movement's current growth are real and well documented, that the remedies socialists propose carry a genuinely contested track record with serious arguments and serious evidence on both sides, and that the debate itself over how a wealthy, technologically advanced society should organize ownership, allocate resources, and guarantee its members a basic floor of security is not new. It is the same argument the Industrial Revolution set off 2 centuries ago, arriving again in a new century, dressed in new language, argued out by a new generation on new platforms, but built on the same fundamental question: who should own the wealth a society creates, and who should decide how it gets shared? The following list is organized to give readers a fair, primary source entry point into both the socialist tradition and its major critics, roughly in order of historical appearance within each column, so that anyone interested can go directly to the sources rather than relying on second-hand summaries. Readers are encouraged to read the primary sources on both sides in full, rather than relying only on secondary commentary, including this essay, before forming a final judgment.